His hand connected with her face before anyone could blink. The slap echoed down the entire hallway. A tray crashed. Medications scattered across the floor like broken teeth. Nurse Sandra Leung pressed her palm to her cheek, eyes wide, too stunned to cry. And James Combs, CEO of Ridgeview Medical Center, straightened his jacket, looked at every frozen face staring back at him, and said completely calm, "Anyone else want to question my decision today?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He had just struck an employee in front of 12 witnesses, and every single one of them looked away. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, he would be on the floor, begging a rookie nurse to let him go. If this is your first time on our channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The nurses at Ridgeview Medical Center had a phrase they used when James Combs was in the building. They did not say his name out loud if they could avoid it. They did not point in his direction. They simply looked at each other and said two words, "He's here." And everyone understood exactly what that meant. It meant straighten your posture. It meant lower your voice. It meant do not make eye contact unless he speaks to you first. And even then, choose your words like you are diffusing a bomb, because one wrong syllable could end your career before lunch. For 5 years, James had ruled Ridgeview the way a general rules occupied territory. Not with respect, not with vision, but with the constant, low-grade terror that something you had done, or something you had failed to do, was already on his radar. He had a memory like a filing cabinet and a temper like a gas leak. You never knew when the smallest spark would set it off. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered with silver hair that he kept neat and a wardrobe that cost more than most of his nurses made in a month. He walked fast, always. Not because he was busy. He walked fast because it gave the people around him less time to prepare. He would materialize at a nursing station unannounced and begin reading charts over someone's shoulder without saying a word. And the silence was its own kind of torture. Was he satisfied? Was he disgusted? Was he about to erupt? You never knew until it was too late. Dr. Alan Marsh, the head of the emergency department, had worked at Ridgeview for 9 years. He had survived 2 hospital mergers, a malpractice lawsuit that was not his fault, and a global pandemic. But he openly told his wife every night that the most stressful part of his job was not the patients. It was the footsteps, specifically the particular rhythm of James Combs' shoes on the linoleum. Hard, fast, deliberate, the kind of sound that made grown men glance toward the nearest exit. He fired someone yesterday, Dr. Marsh told his charge nurse, Patricia Owens, one morning in early October. He said it quietly, the way you report a car accident you just drove past. 12-year employee, Sandra Leung. You know Sandra. Patricia pressed her lips together. What happened? She filed an incident report. Patient complaint. Normal stuff. Except the patient was a donor. Big donor. Dr. Marsh paused. James walked into her office, closed the door, and when it opened again, Sandra was crying and cleaning out her desk. That was it. No HR, no meeting, just gone. Patricia did not respond. There was nothing to say. This was not news. This was weather. You did not argue with weather. You just dressed for it. That was the world Clara Jensen walked into on a crisp Monday morning in October, carrying a canvas tote bag, wearing clean scrubs the color of a calm sky, and smiling at the security guard like she had never heard the name James Combs in her life. She had not, actually. Not yet. Clara was 31 years old. She had transferred from a regional hospital 2 counties over, and her paperwork was clean, her references were excellent, and her interview had gone so smoothly that the nursing director, a careful woman named Diane Torres, had remarked afterward that she seemed almost too composed for someone just starting a new job. She didn't seem nervous at all, Diane told her assistant. Most new hires are at least a little jittery, She just sat there and answered every question like she had all the time in the world. Her first morning on the floor, Clara introduced herself to the staff with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before. Not with arrogance, but with a quiet warmth that made people feel immediately that they were talking to someone who would actually listen if they spoke. She shook hands firmly. She asked questions. She remembered names. Megan Cho, a second-year nurse with dark circles under her eyes and the slightly battle-worn look of someone who had stopped expecting things to get better, was assigned to orient Clara through her first shift. Megan was 26 and had been at Ridgeview long enough to have lost most of her idealism, but not quite enough to have completely surrendered her sense of humor. She watched Clara interact with patients for about 40 minutes before pulling her aside near the supply room. "Okay," Megan said, keeping her voice low. "You seem competent, so I'm going to do you a favor and tell you the thing nobody puts in the employee handbook." Clara tilted her head. "I'm listening." "There's a man named James Comas. He's the CEO. He comes down to the floor sometimes, usually when there's a VIP patient or when something's made the news cycle, or when he just woke up on the wrong side of wherever it is CEOs sleep. And when he comes down here," Megan paused, choosing the words, "you make yourself small. You answer his questions yes or no. You do not push back. You do not offer opinions. You just agree with whatever he says and let him feel like he's in charge, because he is in charge, and the people who forgot that are not here anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Has he ever hurt anyone? Physically?" Megan's expression shifted into something that was not quite surprise and not quite resignation. "Why do you ask that?" "Because the way you described it, it sounds like you're not just talking about someone with a bad attitude." Another pause. Longer this time. Megan looked down the hallway, then back at Clara. "Last February, he was in the ER during a bad night. Triple bypass had complications. Whole floor was chaos. And one of the night nurses, Keisha, she was moving too slow for him apparently. He grabbed her arm, pulled her, left marks." She stopped. "She didn't file a report. She told me later she was afraid she'd lose her job. And then I felt sick because I didn't tell her she was wrong." Clara looked at Megan steadily. "Did anyone else see it?" "3 people. Nobody said anything." Clara nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Just okay." Like she was filing the information away somewhere specific and organized, somewhere she intended to return to later. Megan studied her. "You're not going to just nod and move on, are you?" Clara smiled, small, calm, genuine. "Let's finish the orientation." By the end of her first week, Clara had become something quietly remarkable on that floor. She had a gift with patients that was hard to describe and impossible to fake. The elderly ones in particular responded to her like she had known them for years. She sat with them when no one else had time. She explained procedures with patience that never seemed performative. She held hands during difficult conversations. An 80-year-old retired school teacher named Mr. Ellsworth, who had refused blood draws from 3 different nurses, let Clara do it without a word of protest. When a colleague asked him afterward why he had cooperated, he looked almost confused by the question. "Because she wasn't afraid," he said. "When people are afraid, I can feel it." She wasn't. Word moved through the floor the way it always does in hospitals, sideways, through break room conversations and brief exchanges in hallways. The new nurse, the one with the canvas bag, she's good, she's different. She doesn't seem to know she should be scared. That last observation turned out to be more accurate than anyone realized, though not for the reasons they assumed. It was on a Thursday of her second week that Clara first encountered James Comas directly. Not the version Megan had described, not the legend of him, the actual man, in person, standing at the nurse's station with his jacket buttoned and his expression calibrated to a precise point between displeasure and threat. He was talking to Diane Torres, the nursing director. Or rather, he was talking at her. Diane had the practiced stillness of someone who has learned to absorb force without visibly reacting. Her hands folded on the desk, her face neutral in the way that costs tremendous internal effort. The wait time report for Q3 is unacceptable, James was saying. 22 minutes average for triage. I was at a regional summit last week, and every other system in the state is under 18. Under 18, Diane. What does that say about us? We've been short-staffed since. That's not an answer. That's an excuse. I don't want your excuses. I want your plan. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Clara was 3 feet away, updating a chart. She had not been part of the conversation. She had not been asked to participate, but she looked up from the chart and, without hesitation, said, "If you're looking at the wait time numbers, it's worth noting that 2 of the highest delay shifts were the ones where we had equipment malfunctions in intake. It wasn't staff speed, it was system downtime. The data would look different if you filtered for those shifts separately." The words landed in the air like something dropped from a height. Diane Torres went very still. James Combs turned his head toward Clara in the slow, deliberate way of someone who cannot quite believe what they just heard. He looked at her the way a man looks at a car that has just rolled into his path, not with fury yet, but with the cold, pre-fury assessment of someone recalibrating. "Who are you?" he said. "Clara Jensen. I'm a floor nurse. I started 2 weeks ago." She met his eyes without flinching, not aggressively, not with challenge, just directly. The way you look at someone when you are not afraid of them. Something crossed his face that was not anger and not respect. It was something closer to recalibration, like a machine registering unexpected input. 2 weeks, he said. "Yes. And you're offering analysis on our performance metrics. You seem to be working with incomplete data. I thought it might be useful." The silence stretched. Megan, at the far end of the station, was holding her breath. 2 other nurses had stopped moving. Diane Torres looked like she was bracing for impact. James held Clara's gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned back to Diane and said, "Get me the filtered data by end of day." He walked away. Hard, fast, deliberate shoes on linoleum. The moment he was gone, Megan materialized at Clara's elbow like she had teleported. "What?" she said very quietly. "Was that?" "He had incomplete data," Clara said simply, and went back to her charge. "Clara," Megan's voice had a slight tremor in it, "he does not like being corrected. He does not like it at all. 2 months ago, he sent a department head home for pointing out an error in a budget projection during a board meeting. In front of people. He sent him home like he was a child. The man is 54 years old." "I know," Clara said. "You know and you still—" "Megan," Clara looked at her. "He's a man who uses fear as a management tool because somewhere along the way he learned it works. It works because everyone around him has agreed to let it work." She paused. "I haven't agreed." Megan stared at her. "You've been here 2 weeks." "I know." "He could fire you." "He could try." Later that evening, Diane Torres stopped Clara in the hallway before the end of shift. Diane was 50 years old and had been in hospital administration long enough to have developed a kind of tired pragmatism about most things. But her expression now was something more complicated than tired. She looked like someone standing at the edge of something they weren't sure was solid. "The data point you made today was correct," Diane said quietly. "I have the numbers. I've had them for weeks. I was afraid to present them because James doesn't like being told he's wrong." Clara looked at her with something that was not judgment, not pity, but a kind of patient steadiness. "You should present them anyway." Easy to say. "I know." Clara paused. "What's the worst realistic outcome if you present accurate data to your CEO?" "He gets angry." "And then?" Diane hesitated. "He usually moves on, eventually. So the data gets out and he's angry for a while and then it passes. Or he fires me. Has he ever fired someone for presenting accurate data? Diane opened her mouth, closed it. He fired Sandra. Sandra filed an incident report that reflected badly on a donor. That's a different situation. That was him protecting a relationship, not a data point. Clara held Diane's gaze. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying the thing you're most afraid of might be smaller than you think. Diane was quiet for a long time. You're strange, she finally said. Not unkindly. Clara smiled. I've been told. She walked to her locker, changed out of her scrubs, picked up her canvas tote, and drove home in a 10-year-old Civic with a small crack in the windshield. She lived alone in a second-floor apartment 20 minutes from the hospital. She made herself dinner, nothing complicated, eggs and toast, and sat at her kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her. She wrote in it for a while. Not a journal, not notes from the shift, something more structured. Patterns, observations. The way James had stood when he was trying to dominate a conversation, the angle of his shoulders, the moment his eyes moved before he made a decision. She had done this before, in different places, in very different circumstances. She closed the notebook and went to sleep without difficulty, the way people sleep when they have already decided something and no longer need to debate it with themselves. The following week was a study in contrasts. James continued his rounds, appearances that were less administrative and more territorial. The way certain animals revisit the boundaries of their range, not because they need to, but because the act of marking is itself the point. He came to the floor twice, once to address a patient satisfaction score he considered below standard, once because a doctor had made a scheduling change without his explicit approval, which was technically within the doctor's authority, but which James had decided was an insult. Both times Clara was present. Both times she observed him with the same calm attention. She noticed that he never looked at someone longer than he needed to assess whether they were a threat. She noticed that he raised his voice in increments, never all at once, but escalating, testing, watching for the flinch that told him he had found the limit. She noticed that the one person on the floor whose flinch came latest was Dr. Marsh, and that James seemed to respect this in the particular way that a bully respects someone who costs more to intimidate than they are worth. She also noticed that he noticed her noticing him. It was brief, a glance that lasted half a second longer than a glance should. A slight pause in his trajectory when she came into his peripheral vision. Nothing that anyone else would have registered, but Clara was trained to register things that other people missed. On Wednesday of that second week, she sat in the break room at 3 p.m. with 3 other nurses. Megan, a man named Tyrant who had been at Ridgeview for 7 years, and had the philosophical detachment of someone who has survived a great deal, and a quiet woman named Bev, who mostly listened and only spoke when she had something worth saying. He's getting worse, Tyrant said, turning a coffee cup in his hands. I've seen this cycle before. First it's the small stuff, the snapping, the public dressing downs. Then something happens, usually a board meeting that doesn't go his way, or a performance metric he doesn't like, and then it escalates. Last winter, he threw a phone at the wall in admin. Hit the wall, not a person, but still. He shook his head. The board knows, they have to know, but he brings in the numbers so they look the other way. He grabbed Keisha's arm in February, Megan said. I know about Keisha. Nobody did anything. I know. Terrence set down the cup. And next time nobody will do anything either. Because when you're standing in the moment, when he's right there and his face looks like that, your brain does the math really fast. My job versus this confrontation. And every single time, job wins. That's how it works. That's why he can keep doing it. Clara was listening. She had been quiet for most of the conversation. Now she said, is there anyone on the board who isn't aligned with him? Someone with actual independence? The 3 nurses looked at her. Terrence tilted his head. There's a woman named Helen Carver, board member, retired physician. She's asked questions at meetings that James clearly didn't like. But she's one vote. Is she approachable? I have no idea. Why? Clara picked up her coffee cup. Just thinking, she said, and the way she said it made Terrence study her face for a moment, with an expression that was halfway between curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. Later, walking back to the floor, Megan fell into step beside Clara and said, very quietly, "How much of you is actually new at this?" Clara glanced at her. "Because you don't move like someone who's new at things," Megan said. "You move like someone who's already done everything once and is doing it again on purpose." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've worked in high-stress environments before." "What kind?" A brief pause. "The kind where staying calm wasn't optional." Megan processed this. "That's a very careful answer." "Yes," Clara agreed, "it is." And she walked back to her patient, smiling at an elderly man in room 4 who had been waiting for his afternoon medication. And she sat with him for a while, and he told her about his late wife's garden, and she listened to every word like there was nothing more important happening anywhere in the world. Outside room 4, the hospital moved around her. The codes and the carts and the footsteps and the fear that lived in the walls of Ridgeview Medical Center, like something that had been there so long it had stopped seeming like fear and started seeming like weather. Normal, inevitable, just the way things were. Clara knew better. She had seen walls like this before, and she knew exactly how they came down. The notebook on Clara's kitchen table had 17 pages filled by the end of her third view. Not 17 pages of feelings, 17 pages of facts, names, dates, incidents, patterns, the kind of documentation that a person compiles when they already know where something is headed and they intend to be ready when it arrives. She had started with what Megan told her. Then Terrence added his own history, cautiously at first, then with the slow relief of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long, and finally found someone willing to share the weight. Bev, the quiet one, turned out to have the sharpest memory of all of them. She could recall specific dates, specific words, specific locations. She told Clara about an incident from 14 months ago. James had cornered a young male orderly in the supply corridor after the man had accidentally scheduled a cart delivery during a board tour. James had gotten close enough that the orderly could smell his cologne, had spoken in a low voice that nobody else could hear, and the orderly had handed in his resignation the next morning without explanation. Bev had been around the corner and had heard every word. She had never told anyone. Until now. "Why are you telling me?" Clara asked her. Bev looked at her hands for a moment. "Because you're the first person I've met here who doesn't seem to think we just have to survive him." Clara wrote it all down. Every story, every name, every date she could pin down. She was building something, and she was building it carefully, the way she had been trained to build things under pressure, with patience, with precision, and with the understanding that the moment you stop being systematic is the moment everything falls apart. What she had not yet told anyone, not Megan, not Terrence, not Bev, was that she had already made one quiet phone call, not to HR, not to the board, to a woman named Dr. Lena Park, who worked in healthcare compliance consulting and who had spent 11 years investigating institutional abuse cases across the hospital system. Clara had met Lena at a conference 3 years ago, under circumstances she had not explained to anyone at Ridgeview. They had stayed in contact. When Clara described Ridgevomes in broad strokes, Lena had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "How bad?" "Bad enough that a nurse didn't report a physical assault because she was afraid of losing her job." Another pause. "Do you have documentation?" "I'm building it." "Be careful, Clara." "I always am." That call happened on a Tuesday night. By Thursday morning, Ridgeview was about to give Clara more material than she had anticipated. It started with a patient named Howard Gable. Howard was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer, sharp-minded and stubborn in the particular way of men who have spent their careers solving problems that other people declared unsolvable. He had been admitted for a cardiac workup. His cardiologist wanted a stress test and some imaging, and he had been assigned to Clara's floor. Within 2 hours of his admission, Howard had already argued with one technician about the blood pressure cuff placement, asked 3 pointed questions about his medication timing that nobody had adequately answered, and requested to speak with whoever was in charge of his care. Clara walked into his room, introduced herself, and sat down in the chair beside his bed, instead of standing at the door the way most staff did when they had 14 other things to do. Howard looked at her with a suspicious assessment of a man who had been in hospitals enough times to know the difference between someone going through the motions and someone actually present. He studied her for about 4 seconds, then said, "Okay, you'll do." "I appreciate the confidence," Clara said. They talked for 20 minutes. Clara answered every question he had, not the deflective, liability-cautious, non-answers that patients were so often given, but actual answers, delivered in plain English, with the patient directness of someone who considers it disrespectful to speak to an adult in riddles. By the end of it, Howard Gable was sitting up straighter and looking at Clara with an expression that had moved from skeptical to something approaching genuine warmth. "You're different from the other ones," he said. "Different how?" "You look at me when you talk. Most of them look at the chart." He paused. "Or the door." Clara smiled slightly. "Is there anything else you need before I check on my other patients?" "Just one thing." Howard's expression shifted, became something more careful. "The man who came by this morning, before you came on shift, administrator type, silver hair, expensive suit, he told me my imaging had been pushed back 2 days." Clara kept her expression neutral. "Did he say why?" "Something about scheduling, but the way he said it, like he was doing me a favor by bothering to tell me at all. I've dealt with men like that my whole career. You know what kind of man I mean?" "I think I do," Clara said. "He looked around this room like it was a problem he needed to make disappear." Howard paused. "I don't think he knew I was listening, or maybe he didn't care. His phone rang while he was in here. He didn't step out to answer it. He just took the call, right there, while I was in the bed. Talked about cost restructuring and something about a board presentation. Didn't even look at me." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Gable, is there anything medically you're concerned about with the delay?" "I'm concerned because my cardiologist said the imaging was time-sensitive." He looked at her directly. "And I'm concerned because that man in the expensive suit did not look like someone who was thinking about my health." She told him she would look into it, and she meant it, literally. She went straight to the scheduling system after leaving his room, pulled up his imaging order, and found what she was looking for within 4 minutes. The original imaging had been scheduled for Thursday afternoon. It had been rescheduled, not by the cardiology department and not by the floor, by an administrative override code that traced back to the executive suite. The system logged it at 7:43 in the morning. James Combs arrived at the hospital at 7:30. Clara stood at the terminal for a moment, reading the entry twice. Then she took out her phone and photographed the screen. She was still thinking about it an hour later when Megan appeared at her shoulder with the expression of someone carrying bad news. "James is coming down," Megan said quietly. "He's doing a VIP sweep. There's a patient on the floor, room 11, Marcus Webb." His family donated $2 million to the cardiac wing renovation 3 years ago. James personally oversees any admission involving that family. What's Marcus Webb's condition? Recovering from a hip replacement, clean procedure, no complications. He's actually doing fine. But his wife is here, and she complained this morning that the room was too warm and nobody adjusted it fast enough. Clara almost smiled. "And that requires the CEO to come to the floor." "When it's the Webb family, yes." Megan lowered her voice further. "Clara, I know what I said last week about standing your ground. I heard you. I even admire it. But today, please, Just let him do his VIP thing and leave. He's been in 2 board meetings this week that didn't go well. He's wound tight. This is not the day. Clara looked at her. What do you know about Howard Gable's imaging being rescheduled? Megan blinked. Who? Room 7, 67 years old, cardiac workup. His imaging was moved back 2 days by an admin override this morning. Something crossed Megan's face. Slow recognition, followed by something that looked a lot like dread. Is Webb in room 11? Yes. And Gable is in room 7. Megan pressed her eyes closed for a brief moment. James needed the imaging suite to be clear for Webb's follow-up scan this afternoon. The Webb family requested a private slot, so someone in admin bumped whoever else was in the queue. Howard Gable's cardiologist flagged the imaging as time-sensitive. I know. That doesn't matter to... It matters to me, Clara said. She was calm. Her voice had not changed in pitch or temperature. She was stating a fact. But Megan heard it clearly for what it was. Not a complaint, not frustration, but a decision. Clara had already decided what she was going to do. The question was only when. Megan caught her arm. Please tell me you're not going to make an issue of this today. I'm going to advocate for my patient, Clara said. That's my job. But Clara was already moving down the hallway. James Combs arrived on the floor at 11:47. He came with his assistant, a tightly wound man named Paul, who carried a tablet and took notes at a speed that suggested he had long ago given up on most other forms of self-expression. James went directly to room 11. He spent 12 minutes with Marcus Webb and his wife. Clara could hear the register of his voice through the door, smooth and solicitous, the precise performance of a man who has learned to perform warmth the way an actor learns an accent. Present enough to be convincing, gone the moment it stops being useful. He came out of room 11 in a good mood. This was, Clara had already learned, the most dangerous version of James Combs. When he was in a bad mood, he was blunt and loud, and you could see it coming. When he was in a good mood, he was expansive, entitled, and far more likely to say something that revealed exactly who he was. He stopped at the nurse's station, where Clara was updating Howard Gable's chart. He glanced at the screen without being invited to, the territorial reflex of someone who has never learned to knock. How are we looking on the floor today? He asked, not addressing anyone in particular. Stable, Clara said. She did not look up immediately. Let the pause exist for 1 full second before she raised her eyes. Mr. Combs, I have a question about a patient in room 7. His expression remained pleasant, performatively pleasant. Go ahead. Howard Gable. His cardiac imaging was rescheduled this morning by an administrative override. His cardiologist's notes indicate the imaging was time-sensitive. Can you tell me what the clinical rationale was for moving it back 2 days? The pleasantness stayed on his face, but something behind it changed, like a light changing color without changing brightness. Scheduling adjustments get made for operational reasons. That's not a floor-level concern. It is when it affects patient care timelines. A beat of silence. Paul, the assistant, had stopped typing. The adjustment was appropriate, James said. His voice was still even, still controlled. The clinical team was consulted. I checked the override log. It was entered at 7:43 this morning. Dr. Reyes, Gable's cardiologist, starts rounds at 8:15. There's no note in the system from Dr. Reyes authorizing the delay. The pleasant expression didn't disappear. It calcified. I'm going to suggest you be very careful about how you're choosing to spend your time today, Nurse Jensen. I'm spending it advocating for my patient. Your patient is stable. His cardiologist disagrees. And with respect, you're not his cardiologist. The hallway had gone very quiet. 3 nurses at the station had developed a sudden, intense interest in their screens. Dr. Marsh had appeared at the edge of the hallway, attracted by the specific quality of that silence, the kind that only happens when something is about to become irreversible. James leaned forward slightly, both hands on the counter. His voice dropped. This was a different register. the low, private register he used when he wanted to hurt someone without witnesses. You've been here less than a month. I would think very carefully before deciding this is the hill you want to die on. Clara met his eyes. I'm going to request that Dr. Reyes be notified about the reschedule and given the opportunity to review the decision. That's standard protocol for any administratively overridden clinical order. I'm going to document this conversation and file it with the charge nurse. She paused. Those aren't threats. That's just what I'm going to do. James stared at her. 30 years of having his word treated as final. And this woman, 5'5", 3 weeks on the job, canvas tote in her locker, was telling him, calmly and precisely, and without the slightest tremor in her voice, exactly what she intended to do. He straightened, buttoned his jacket, said nothing. He walked away. Paul followed, the click of expensive shoes on linoleum fading down the corridor. Dr. Marsh exhaled. He had not realized he had been holding his breath. He walked to the nurse's station and stood next to Clara for a moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "He's going to make your life difficult." "He already was," Clara said. "Now at least it's on the record." Howard Gable's imaging was reinstated to Thursday afternoon. Nobody explained why. The override was quietly reversed sometime in the early afternoon. Clara noticed it when she checked the system at 2 o'clock, and she noted it in her records with the same precision she noted everything else. At 3:15, she received a message from HR requesting a meeting at the end of her shift. She was not surprised. She read the message, replied to confirm, and went to check on Mr. Gable. He was reading a newspaper when she came in. He looked up, read her face the way sharp old men read situations they've seen before, and said, "You did something on my behalf today, didn't you?" "I made sure your imaging was back on schedule." He was quiet for a moment. "Did it cost you?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Howard put the newspaper down. "How long have you been a nurse?" "Long enough." "You don't talk like a new nurse." "No," she agreed. "I don't." He studied her. "My daughter-in-law is a corporate attorney. She handles employment cases. I'm going to give you her card before I'm discharged, and I want you to take it." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That's very kind, Mr. Gable." "I'm not kind," he said flatly. "I'm practical. There's a difference." The HR meeting lasted 22 minutes. The HR director was a man named Steve Pollard, who had worked at Ridgeview for 8 years and had the careful, slightly depressed bearing of someone who has spent those 8 years navigating the gap between what the policy manual says and what actually happens in that building. He sat across from Clara with a manila folder in front of him and explained that a concern had been raised about her professionalism and her tendency to challenge administrative decisions in public settings. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'd like to note for the record that my concern was clinical, not administrative. A patient's imaging order had been overridden without documented physician authorization. My actions were consistent with standard advocacy protocol as outlined in the Nursing Code of Conduct. I have documentation of the timeline if it would be helpful." Steve looked at the folder, then at Clara. "You have documentation already." "I document everything," she said. "I find it useful." Another pause. "Miss Jensen, I want to be transparent with you. This meeting is, let's call it a formality, a flag. Nobody is pursuing discipline at this time, but I want you to understand that patterns of conflict with executive staff tend to have consequences at this organization, regardless of who's technically right." "I appreciate the transparency, Steve," Clara said. "I'd like a written summary of this meeting, including today's date, the nature of the concern raised, and who raised it." Steve looked like a man who had just been asked to do the last thing he wanted to do. "That's not standard for an informal—" "I know," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm requesting it anyway." She left the HR office at 5:40 with a promise that the written summary would be sent within 48 hours. She knew it would come. Steve Pollard was a man who followed procedures when procedures were invoked, even when procedures were inconvenient. She had counted on exactly that. In the parking lot, Megan was waiting beside Clara's car. She had her coat on and her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a speech for 20 minutes and is no longer sure they want to give it. "I'm not going to lecture you," Megan said. "Okay. I just need you to hear me for 1 second. "I'm listening." Megan looked at her, looked at the building behind her, looked back. 7 people have been fired from this hospital in the last 3 years for reasons that had nothing to do with performance. Real reasons. Real people with mortgages and kids and 15 years of career behind them. One of them was my friend. She was better at her job than anyone on that floor, and she made James angry one afternoon, and 6 weeks later, she didn't exist here anymore. That is what you are walking into. Eyes open. Clara looked at her friend, and Megan was a friend by now. She had become one without either of them officially deciding it, and said something she had not said to anyone at Ridgeview yet. "Megan, I need you to trust me." "I do trust you. That's why I'm standing in a parking lot in 40-degree weather." "No, I mean, really trust me. The way you trust someone when they tell you they've done this before." The words landed differently than casual reassurance. There was a weight behind them, a specificity. Megan went still. "Done what before?" A pause. Not evasion. Careful, deliberate pacing. "Taken down systems that were built on fear." Clara held her gaze. "I've been in places where fear was the operating mechanism. Institutional fear. The kind that feels permanent. The kind that makes smart, good people like you and Terrence and Bev tell yourselves every morning that this is just how it is." She paused. "It isn't permanent. It just feels that way until someone decides it isn't." Megan was very quiet. The parking lot was cold and empty around them. "Who are you?" Megan said softly. "Like, really, who are you?" Clara's expression was warm and steady and completely unreadable. "I'm your colleague," she said, "and I'm watching his patterns. And when the right moment comes, I need to know you won't look away." Megan stared at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the lot. Somewhere behind them, a car started. Megan breathed in, breathed out, and said, "Okay, just okay." But the way she said it meant something different now. Clara drove home, opened her notebook, added 3 pages, made a second call to Dr. Lena Park, this time for longer, this time with names and specifics and dates and the particular detail about the administrative override that had been quietly reversed after a nurse asked one documented question in a public hallway. Lena listened. When Clara finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Clara," she said, "how many people have stories like this?" "At least 9 that I know of personally, probably more." "And they're willing to come forward?" "Not yet, but they will be." Clara tapped the pen on the notebook. "He's going to make a move. He always does when someone doesn't flinch. He can't help it. It's the only tool he knows. He's going to escalate, and when he does?" "When he does," Clara said quietly, "I need everything already in place." She closed the notebook. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city went about its ordinary business, completely unaware that inside a second-floor apartment, a woman who had spent 8 years in situations that would have broken most people was calmly, systematically, and with absolute clarity of purpose, dismantling the architecture of a tyrant's power, one documented fact at a time. She slept well that night. She always slept well when the plan was solid, and the plan was solid. The written summary from HR arrived in Clara's email 41 hours after the meeting with Steve Pollard. She read it once, saved it to a folder she had labeled with nothing but a date, and forwarded a copy to Dr. Lena Park. Then she went to work. It was Monday, the beginning of her 4th week at Ridgeview Medical Center, and something had shifted over the weekend, not visibly, not loudly, but in the particular way that pressure shifts inside a structure before anything cracks. The staff could feel it. Not all of them could name it, but they felt it in the way people feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Something had happened between Clara and James on Thursday. Something had been said in a hallway in front of witnesses. Something had been documented. And in a place where nothing was ever documented because documentation meant you had chosen a side, that fact alone was seismic. Terrence told Clara about it directly when she arrived for her morning shift. He was at the locker room door, coffee in hand, and he said it without preamble the way he said most things. People are talking about Thursday. What are they saying? Some of them are scared for you. Some of them are... He paused, chose the word carefully. Watching, like they want to see what happens next, but they're not ready to be part of it yet. That's honest, Clara said. I'm always honest when it doesn't cost me anything. He looked at her over the cup. When it does cost something, I tend to get quiet. I'm telling you that about myself so you know where I stand. Clara looked at him. I know where you stand, Terrence, and I know it's going to move. He did not answer that, but he held the door open for her, which was its own kind of answer. The morning was unremarkable on the surface. Rounds, medications, charting, the ordinary architecture of a hospital floor functioning at capacity. Howard Gable had his imaging rescheduled back on Thursday and was in good spirits. He pressed his daughter-in-law's card into Clara's hand again. She had declined it twice already, and this time she took it. He watched her put it in her pocket and said nothing, which meant he understood something she had not explained to him. At 10:45, James Combs fired someone. Clara heard about it the way everyone heard about it, through Megan, who had heard it from Paul, the assistant, who had said it without realizing who Megan was. The person fired was a man named Robert Chu. Robert was a hospital administrator, mid-level, in charge of facilities coordination. He had been at Ridgeview for 6 years. He had worked directly under James for the last 2. He had made the mistake, the specific, targeted, irreversible mistake, of forwarding an internal email to the wrong distribution list. The email contained a budget note about cost reallocations that James had not yet made public. Nobody outside the executive team was supposed to see those numbers. Robert had clicked the wrong button. Within 90 minutes, he was cleaning out his desk. No HR meeting, no warning, no process. Just James appearing in Robert's office and closing the door. And when the door opened, Robert's face was the color of chalk, and his hands were shaking. Clara was told about this at 11:15. By 11:20, she had stopped what she was doing and was standing at the window at the end of the hallway, not looking at anything, just thinking. Megan came and stood beside her. "Don't say anything," Megan said first. "I wasn't going to." "You had that look." "What look?" "The look you get when you're calculating something." Megan crossed her arms. "Robert has 2 kids. His wife had surgery last spring. He can't afford to lose that job." "I know," Clara said. "So what are you calculating?" Clara turned from the window. "Whether this is the escalation I was waiting for, or whether there's one more coming." Megan stared at her. "You were waiting for an escalation?" "He was always going to escalate. The question was what form it would take." Clara's voice was even, measured, the tone of someone running a clinical assessment. "Firing Robert is a message. It's directed at everyone who saw Thursday. It's him reasserting that he still controls consequences. He needs us to know that what happened with me was an anomaly, not a shift." "Is he right?" Clara looked at her directly. "No." She spent her lunch break making a phone call she had been preparing for since the previous week. The person she called was Helen Carver, the board member Terrence had mentioned, the retired physician, the one who asked questions at meetings that James did not like. Clara had found her through publicly available board records and a professional directory. She had composed and recomposed her opening sentences 4 times before she was satisfied with them. She dialed from the parking garage at 12:10. Helen Carver answered on the 3rd ring with the brisk efficiency of someone who screens calls carefully and only picks up when something clears the filter. Clara identified herself, said she was a nurse at Ridgeview, said she had something to share that was clinical, documented, and serious, and that she wanted to share it with a board member before she made any other moves. She said it in 60 seconds, clearly, without apology. There was a pause, then Helen said, "How documented?" Time-stamped, cross-referenced, multiple corroborating sources. Another pause. Longer. "Are you at risk right now?" The question surprised Clara slightly. Not the content of it. She had expected skepticism or redirection or a polite brush-off. But the directness of the question suggested that Helen Carver had been waiting for a phone call like this for longer than Clara had been making it. "I received an HR flag last week," Clara said. "Nothing formal yet. When can you meet?" "Whenever you can." "Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock. There's a coffee shop on Meridian called Foundry. Do you know it?" "I'll find it." "Bring everything," Helen said, "and tell no one you're coming." Clara hung up and stood in the parking garage for a moment with the phone in her hand. Something that was not quite relief and not quite anticipation moved through her chest. She had placed a piece on the board, and it had landed exactly where she needed it. Now she had to protect it. She went back to work. She said nothing to Megan about the call. She said nothing to anyone. She spent the afternoon the way she spent every afternoon, present, careful, thorough, room to room, patient to patient, building the ordinary, unremarkable record of a nurse who shows up and does her job and gives no one any reason to look at her too closely. At 4:30, James came to the floor again. This time he did not come for a patient. He came for her. He did not announce it that way. He came to the nurse's station with the excuse of reviewing a facilities report that had nothing to do with the nursing floor, and he stationed himself 15 feet from where Clara was working, and he stayed there. Not engaging, not addressing her, just present, occupying the space the way a large cold front occupies a weather map, not doing anything specific, just making everything around it colder. Clara was aware of him the entire time. She did not look over. She did not adjust her pace. She continued exactly what she was doing, which was coordinating a medication review for a patient in room 3. And she did it with the same unhurried precision she brought to every task. Bev noticed. She appeared briefly at Clara's elbow and murmured, "He's been there 12 minutes. "I know," Clara said without looking up. "He keeps looking at you." "I know." "And you're just working," Clara said, "same as always." James left at 4:52. He had not spoken to her. He had not spoken to anyone. He had stood there for 22 minutes and then walked away, and the effect he had intended, to unsettle, to remind, to make her feel the weight of his attention, had simply not landed. Because Clara Jensen had spent 8 years in environments where the cost of being unsettled was measured in things far heavier than a job, and she had long ago trained herself out of the flinch reflex that men like James Combs depended on. But she noted the visit, time-stamped it, added it to the folder. Tuesday passed. Wednesday arrived with the particular gray quiet of a mid-autumn morning, and Clara moved through her shift with the internal awareness that the day had a specific destination. 7 o'clock, a coffee shop on Meridian, a board member who had asked her to bring everything. At 2 in the afternoon, the shift gave her a complication she had not planned for. A patient in room 9, a 51-year-old woman named Grace Adomako, admitted for a respiratory infection that had turned more serious than the initial triage suggested, took a sudden turn. Her oxygen saturation dropped. Her breathing changed. Clara was in the room within 40 seconds of the monitor alarm, assessed the situation in another 15, and called for Dr. Marsh. What followed was 45 minutes of focused, controlled crisis management. Doctor Marsh was good under pressure. Clara had already established this, and between the two of them they stabilized Grace Adomako without escalating to the ICU, which had been the alternative. When it was over and Grace was breathing steadily, and her family had been called and her chart was updated, Clara stood in the hallway outside room 9 and exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Dr. Marsh came and stood beside her. They were both quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet after something almost happened and didn't. "Good catch," he said. "She was deteriorating faster than the chart suggested." "I know. The morning team missed it." He paused. "You didn't." Clara looked at him. "How long have you been at Ridgeview?" 9 years. "And in those 9 years, before all of this, before James, before whatever this place became, was it a good hospital?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about it seriously, not defensively. "It was," he finally said. 10, 12 years ago, this floor had a culture that I was proud of. People stayed. They cared. The turnover rate was nothing like it is now." He paused. "I've watched it change, and I've told myself it was the industry, the economics, the pressures of modern healthcare. But I think I've been telling myself that so I didn't have to say the obvious thing, which is that one man changed this place, and the rest of us let it happen because it was easier than the alternative." Clara looked at him steadily. "What would it take for you to say that on the record?" Dr. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. A cart moved past them in the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang and was answered. The ordinary sounds of a floor that almost lost a patient and kept going anyway. "A year ago, I would have told you nothing," he said. "I would have told you I had a family and a mortgage, and I couldn't afford the fight." He looked at Grace Adomaco's door. "But I've been watching you for 3 weeks, Clara, and I've been watching what happens to this floor when someone in it decides they're not afraid. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think I've been using fear as an excuse for long enough." Clara said nothing. She let the words sit where they had landed. "I have documentation of my own," Dr. Marsh said, more quietly. "Incidents, decisions he made that were clinically wrong, that I documented internally but never escalated because I knew what escalating would cost. I have 9 years of it." Clara turned to face him fully. "Would you be willing to share it?" "With the right person. There's a board member, her name is Helen Carver. She's asked to meet with me tonight." Dr. Marsh looked at her. Something moved across his face, a combination of recognition and something that was almost like the specific relief of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right moment and has just been told it might have arrived. "Tonight," he repeated. 7 o'clock. He nodded slowly. "Send me the address." At 5:45, as Clara was finishing her charting and getting ready to hand off to the evening shift, Megan came to her with an expression she had not worn before. Not the cautious worry she usually carried. Not the watchful tension of someone waiting for something bad to happen. This was different. This was the expression of someone who had made a decision and was not entirely sure it was the right one, but had made it anyway. "I talked to Keisha," Megan said. Clara went still. "When?" "This afternoon. I called her. She's been working at a clinic across town since she left here. I told her—" Megan paused. "I told her someone was building a case. I didn't use your name. I just told her someone was building it carefully and with documentation, and that if she wanted to be part of it, now might be the time." "What did she say?" Megan's eyes were bright with something that was somewhere between grief and determination. "She cried, and then she said yes. She said she had photographs of the bruising on her arm that she never showed anyone. She took them the same night it happened. She said she didn't know why she took them, just that something told her to, even when she was too scared to use them." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "That's important, Megan. That's very important." "I know," Megan exhaled. "I should have called her a year ago. I should have done this a year ago. I didn't." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. "I'm doing it now." "That's enough," Clara said simply. She read through the documentation without speaking, going page by page, her expression not changing, but her jaw tightening incrementally with each new entry. When she finished, she set the last page down, looked at Clara, looked at Dr. Marsh, said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "I've been on this board for 4 years, and I have suspected, specifically and with increasing certainty, that something like this was happening. But suspicion is not the same as evidence." She touched the edge of the folder. "This is evidence." "There's more," Clara said. "A former nurse named Keisha Daniels. She has photographic documentation of physical injury." Helen was very still. "Physical assault." "Yes." Another silence. Helen looked out the window for a moment, and when she looked back, her expression had resolved into something harder and more purposeful than it had been before. "I need to know one thing," she said. "How many people is this?" 9 confirmed. Possibly more who haven't been contacted yet. "And they're willing to come forward officially?" "They will be," Clara said, "when they see the process is protected. When they believe that coming forward won't cost them what staying silent already cost them." Helen looked at her carefully. "You've done this before." It was not a question. Clara heard the echo of Megan's voice from the parking lot. "Who are you? Really? Who are you?" And she answered Helen the same way she had answered Dr. Marsh when he had looked at her with that same calculating recognition. "I've been in situations where someone needed to hold the line," Clara said. "I know how to do it." Helen nodded, slowly. Then she picked up the folder and held it against her chest with both hands, like it was something she intended to guard carefully. "I'm going to need 48 hours, she said. "I need to contact the board's legal counsel without going through the executive office. That has to be done carefully." She paused. "In the meantime, nothing changes on the floor. You go to work. You do your job. You give him no reason to accelerate." "Understood," Clara said. "If he makes a move before I'm ready—" "I'll handle it," Clara said. Helen looked at her. The particular look of a woman who has lived long enough to know the difference between confidence and recklessness. She saw neither recklessness nor bravado in Clara Jensen's face. She saw the same thing Megan had seen in the parking lot, the same thing Dr. Marsh had seen in the hallway outside room 9. The steady, organized calm of someone who has already run the scenarios and knows exactly what they are prepared to do. "You'll handle it," Helen repeated, not doubtfully, more like she was committing the phrase to memory. "Yes," Clara said. She drove home at 9:30. The city moved past her windows in streaks of yellow and white. She made tea instead of coffee because it was late and her body knew to wind down even when her mind was still running. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top: 48 hours. Then she set the pen down and sat with the quiet. In 48 hours, the board's legal counsel would be briefed. In 48 hours, Keisha Daniels would have been contacted officially. In 48 hours, 9 people's documented experiences would be in the hands of someone with the institutional power to act on them. But James Combs did not know about the 48 hours. James Combs did not know about Helen Carver, or the folder, or the corner booth at Foundry Coffee. James Combs did not know about Keisha's photographs or Dr. Marsh's 9 years of documented incidents, or the quiet, systematic architecture that had been assembled around him in the space of less than 4 weeks. What James Combs knew was that a rookie nurse had not flinched, and that was already more than he could tolerate. Clara knew him well enough by now to know what that meant. He had a board presentation on Friday. Something about the quarterly numbers, something about capital projects and donor relations, and the carefully maintained performance of a hospital that looked excellent on paper. He could not afford a disruption before Friday. He could not afford the story of a floor nurse who had documented him and connected with a board member and was quietly dismantling his infrastructure to spread through the building before he had the chance to control the narrative. He was going to act before Friday. She was almost certain of it. She finished her tea, checked that the folder was where she had left it, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed with the clean, focused calm of someone who has done everything they can do tonight and is ready for what comes tomorrow. Tomorrow was Thursday. She was right about Thursday. She knew it the moment she walked through the main entrance at 6:58 in the morning and felt the quality of the silence in the lobby. There is a specific texture to silence in an institution when something has already happened that most people don't know about yet. It is too still. The ordinary background noise of a hospital morning, the carts, the overhead announcements, the low conversation at the reception desk, was all present, but underneath it there was a held breath quality, the kind that happens when information is moving through a building faster than the people carrying it can keep up with. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Dennis who had nodded at Clara every morning for 4 weeks, did not nod at her today. He looked at her for half a second too long, then looked away. That was enough. She went to the locker room, changed into her scrubs, tied her shoes with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, and then she sat on the bench for exactly 90 seconds with her hands on her knees and her eyes open, running through the variables. James was going to move today. She did not know the form. She did not know the timing. She knew only that he had spent 4 days processing the fact that she had not broken, and men like James did not process that kind of information quietly or for long. Megan was already at the nurse's station when Clara came onto the floor. Megan looked up from her chart with an expression that confirmed everything the lobby silence had suggested. "He called an all-staff meeting," Megan said. "Emergency, 8 o'clock, main conference room." What reason did he give? Performance accountability review. Megan said the words like she was reading a diagnosis she hadn't wanted to confirm. It's not a real review. He does these sometimes when he wants to make a point to the whole floor at once. Last time he did one, 2 people resigned before the week was out. Clara absorbed this. Who else knows what it's really about? Everyone knows what it's really about. Megan's voice was tight. He's doing it because of you. He can't fire you without documentation of cause, and he knows you've been documenting everything, so he can't touch you directly yet. So he does this instead. He stands up in front of the whole floor and makes the environment so hostile that the person he's targeting either breaks or quits. Has it worked before? Every single time. Clara was quiet for a moment. Down the hallway, the early shift was handing off to the day team, the quiet, efficient exchange of information that happened at the beginning of every shift. Lives summarized in bullet points and vital signs. The ordinary machinery of care continuing regardless of whatever was about to happen in the conference room at 8 o'clock. "I need you to do something for me," Clara said. "Name it. Text Terrence and Bev. Tell them to come to the meeting prepared to observe. Not to speak, not to act, just to be present and to remember everything they see and hear." Megan nodded. "And you?" "I'll be there." At 7:45, Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Marsh. It said only, "I heard about the meeting. I'll be there." She replied with a single word, "Good." At 7:50, another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize, which resolved into something significant when she read the message. It was Helen Carver. It said, "Board council brief last night. Process initiated. Do not escalate today if you can avoid it. We need 24 more hours." Clara read it twice, typed back, "Understood." Then she put her phone in her pocket and thought about the gap between what Helen was asking and what James was about to do. 24 hours. She needed to absorb whatever came next without breaking or escalating. She needed to hold the line for one more day. She had held lines under far worse conditions than a conference room full of frightened people and a man who had never been genuinely challenged in his life. She could do this. The conference room held about 60 people at capacity. By 8:03, it was standing room, which meant that the summons had gone beyond the nursing floor. It had pulled in admin staff, department coordinators, a handful of residents. People stood along the walls with the particular discomfort of an audience that suspects they are about to witness something unpleasant, and has not yet decided whether to be grateful or ashamed that they are watching instead of participating. James Combs stood at the front of the room in a dark suit with his hands clasped in front of him. He had the composed, deliberate energy of someone who had been looking forward to this. Paul stood slightly behind him to the left with the tablet. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the person with the most power has not yet spoken, and everyone is waiting to learn what kind of mood they are dealing with. He let the silence run for 6 seconds. Clara counted. She was standing near the back between Terrence and Megan, and she watched him with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She noticed that his eyes swept the room in sections, methodically, until they found her. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then moved on. That was the tell. The whole meeting was organized around that 2-second moment, and everyone in the room would eventually understand it, even if they couldn't name it yet. "I want to talk about standards," James said. His voice was rich and controlled, the voice of a man who learned long ago that volume is less effective than precision. "Specifically, I want to talk about what happens to this organization when individuals decide that their personal judgment supersedes institutional protocol." He paused. Let it land. "We have processes here. We have chains of command. We have administrative frameworks that exist for very good reasons. Liability management, resource allocation, patient safety. These frameworks are not suggestions. They are the architecture of a functioning hospital." He walked slowly along the front of the room. "When individuals, regardless of their role, regardless of their tenure here, decide to operate outside those frameworks, they don't just create problems for themselves. They create problems for every single person in this room. They create exposure. They create instability. They create an environment where no one can trust that the person next to them is operating by the same rules." Clara kept her breathing even. She could feel Megan beside her, very still, very tense. "I have been made aware," James continued, his voice dropping slightly, "of several instances in recent weeks where established administrative decisions were publicly challenged by floor-level staff, where executive communications were questioned in open settings, where patient care justifications were used as cover for what were, in reality, personal agendas." He stopped walking. "That ends today." The room did not move. 60 people trying to make themselves smaller, which was exactly what he wanted. Clara raised her hand. The effect was immediate and physical. It moved through the room like a current through water, visible, traceable, affecting every person it passed through. Megan made a sound that was not quite a word. Terrence went very still. James looked at her hand, then at her face. For the first time since she had known him, she saw something move in his expression that was not performance. Something real and immediate and involuntary. He had not expected this. He had expected her to stand there and absorb it. He had given every previous target the same treatment, and every one of them had stood there and absorbed it. "Yes," he said. The word had an edge like a blade being cleaned. Clara spoke clearly, at a volume that reached every corner of the room. "I'd like to ask a clarifying question about the administrative decision you're referencing. When a floor nurse observes that a patient's clinically time-sensitive imaging order has been overridden without documented physician authorization, which specific institutional protocol should they follow? Because the nursing code of conduct explicitly requires patient advocacy in that situation. I want to make sure I'm applying the correct framework." Dead silence. Then James said, very quietly, "This is not the appropriate venue for that question. You opened the conversation about institutional frameworks and protocols," Clara said. "I'm asking which one applies. That seems directly relevant." Someone in the room, Clara didn't see who, made a sound. Not a laugh, something involuntary and quickly suppressed. But James heard it, his jaw tightened by a fraction. "We'll discuss your specific situation separately," he said. The words were controlled, but there was something moving underneath them now. something hot and pressurized, like steam finding the edges of a sealed container. "I'll look forward to that," Clara said. "I'll make sure to have documentation available." She lowered her hand. She kept her expression neutral, informational, not triumphant, not provocative, just the face of someone who asked a reasonable question and received an incomplete answer. James moved through the rest of the meeting in 11 minutes. He said several more things about institutional loyalty and professional standards and the consequences of what he called performative dissent. And every word was directed at Clara while being addressed to the room, which is a technique that looks like strength and is actually the opposite of it. He dismissed the gathering at 8:22 and left without taking questions. The room exhaled. 60 people suddenly in motion, collecting themselves, not looking at each other the way people don't look at each other after something they are not sure they should have witnessed. Dr. Marsh appeared at Clara's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "Fine," she said. "He didn't touch me. He tried to embarrass me publicly and it didn't work. That's actually useful." "Useful how?" "Because now there are 60 witnesses to the fact that he held an all-staff meeting specifically to target a single employee. I need you to document what you observed. Time, date, approximate content. Can you do that?" "Already composing it in my head," he said. By 9:15, the floor was back to normal operations, or as close to normal as anything got at Ridgeview. But something had changed in the texture of the day. Clara could feel it in the way people moved around her. Not avoidance, not the careful distance of colleagues who don't want to be associated with someone in trouble. Something closer to the way people move around a person they have decided to watch more carefully because they are no longer sure what they previously believed about that person is accurate. At 10:05, Bev appeared at Clara's side while she was updating a chart. Bev, the quiet one, the one who only spoke when she had something worth saying. "3 people came to me this morning," she said in a voice so low Clara had to lean slightly to hear it. "After the meeting, people I've worked with for years who have never said a word about James to me before. They wanted to know if what they heard was true, that someone was building a case." Clara looked at her. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I didn't know anything officially." Bev paused. "But I told them that if they had something to say, they should say it somewhere it would be heard." She met Clara's eyes. "I hope that was right." "That was exactly right," Clara said. At 11:30, Steve Pollard from HR called Clara's cell and asked if she had time for a brief conversation. She said yes. He said that following the morning meeting, there had been a formal request from executive leadership to initiate a performance review of her conduct. He said it in the careful, over-neutral tone of a man reading from a script he didn't write and doesn't particularly endorse. He said the review would begin the following week, pending standard notification procedures. Clara said, "Steve, I need this call documented. Will you send me a written confirmation of this notification, including the specific conduct concerns being cited, within the next 4 hours?" A pause. Yes, that's within your rights. Thank you, Steve." She hung up. She texted Helen Carver. "Formal performance review initiated today. Timeline accelerating. How are we positioned?" The reply came 8 minutes later, faster than she expected. "Council has reviewed preliminary documentation. Board emergency session being scheduled for tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Hold on, we're almost there." Almost there. Clara looked at the words. Then she put the phone away and went to check on Grace Adamaco in room 9, who was breathing steadily and had asked that morning if Clara could bring her a different book from the patient library because she had already finished the first one. The afternoon hit its stride. 12:30, 1 o'clock, 1:45. The floor ran at capacity, clean and professional. The kind of work that happens when people who are good at their jobs do them, regardless of what else is happening around them. Clara moved through it with the focused calm that had become, for the rest of the staff, a kind of navigational reference point. If Clara was calm, the situation was manageable. It had become an unofficial metric without anyone deciding to make it one. At 2:15, the first domino fell in a direction no one had anticipated. A woman appeared at the nurse's station and asked for Clara by name. She was in her late 30s, professional-looking, wearing a visitor's badge that identified her as coming from an external organization. She said her name was Michelle Daniels. Megan was at the station when she arrived and heard the name and went very still. Daniels. Keisha's last name was Daniels. Clara came to the station and recognized what was happening before Michelle had to explain it. Michelle was Keisha's older sister. Keisha had asked her to come in person because Keisha herself was not ready to walk through those doors again. Not yet, maybe not ever, but she had something she needed Clara to have. Michelle opened her bag and placed a sealed envelope on the counter. She printed them, Michelle said, the photographs, and she wrote out a statement, dates, times, what happened, what he said, what the marks looked like. She did it last night. She was up until 2 in the morning doing it. Michelle's voice was controlled, but her eyes were something else. She said to tell you she's sorry it took so long. Clara picked up the envelope, held it for a moment. Tell her she has nothing to be sorry for, she said. Tell her she's brave, and tell her it's almost over. Michelle nodded, looked at the station, at the floor, at the people around her who had gone quiet in the particular way of people who have just heard something that changed the shape of the room. She misses this place, Michelle said softly. She misses nursing. He took that from her. I know, Clara said. We're going to fix that. At 3 o'clock, while Clara was adding Keisha's envelope to the documentation she had secured in her locker, her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered it. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Gerald Hume. He identified himself as a former director of operations at Ridgeview. He had been with the hospital for 11 years before being forced out 18 months ago. He had read something, he didn't say what, and had been given Clara's number by someone he didn't identify. He said he had financial documentation, budget reallocations that he believed were improper. He said he had never come forward because he had been made to sign a settlement agreement that included a non-disparagement clause, and he had been told by his attorney at the time that the clause was binding. Have you had anyone review that agreement recently? Clara asked. No. Some non-disparagement clauses in settlements have enforceability limits, particularly when the conduct being covered constitutes illegal activity. She paused. I'm not an attorney, but the people I'm working with are connected to board counsel, and I think you should talk to them. A long silence. You're really doing this, Gerald said, not skeptically, almost with wonder. We really are, Clara said. She texted Dr. Lena Park immediately after hanging up. Former director, possible financial irregularities, settlement with NDA clause. Can your contacts review for enforceability? The reply came in 4 minutes. Yes, have him call me directly. Send me his number. By 4 o'clock, Clara had brokered 3 separate connections between people who had been isolated in their individual experiences for years and the network that was now assembled around them. The network that James Comas did not know existed. The network that had been built in 4 weeks in the margins of 12-hour shifts, in parking lot conversations, in a corner booth at a coffee shop on Meridian. At 4:47, James Comas came to the floor for the last time that Thursday. He did not come for a patient. He did not come for a chart or a report or a performance review. He came the way a man comes when he has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. He walked fast, faster than usual, and his expression had moved beyond the calibrated intimidation of his normal floor appearances into something rawer and more immediate. Paul was not with him. He went directly to where Clara was standing at the end of the hallway, outside room 7, finishing a note in Howard Gable's chart. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough that the conversation was private, far enough that it was not yet physical. The particular geography of a man who is deciding how far he intends to go. You think you built something, he said. His voice was low and had a quality in it that Clara had not heard from him before. Not performance now. Something real. Something that had been running underneath all the performances for a long time and was now too close to the surface to manage properly. I've been doing my job, Clara said. I know what you've been doing. I know who you've been talking to. I know about the documentation. His jaw was tight. You have no idea what you put in motion. You've been here a month. You think you understand this institution. You think you understand what it takes to run a hospital of this size in this environment? I have held this place together for 5 years through budget crises and regulatory audits and a pandemic that broke every other system in the region. I kept this hospital solvent. I kept these people employed. His voice dropped further. And you, a nurse who has been here 4 weeks, you think you can walk in here with your little notebook and your careful questions and just dismantle everything I built? Clara waited. She let him finish. And then she said with the same quiet evenness she brought to everything, the things you've built that serve this hospital and the patients in it, none of that is under threat. The things you built to protect yourself at the expense of the people who work here, those are done. He stared at her. His breathing had changed. His hands, which had been at his sides, moved slightly. Not reaching, not yet, but the way a man's hands move when his body is ahead of his mind. And then, from the doorway of room 7, Howard Gable's voice cut through the hallway like something dropped from a height. Clear, loud, completely deliberate. Nurse Jensen, could you come in here, please? And bring whoever that is with you. I want a witness for what I'm about to say. James turned toward the voice. Howard Gable was in the doorway in his hospital gown, 67 years old and completely unimpressed, looking at James Comey's with the steady, evaluating gaze of a man who spent his career looking at structures and identifying exactly where they were about to fail. Who are you? James said, the automatic authority reflex kicking in, even now. Howard Gable, civil engineer, retired. I've been in this room for 4 days and I've watched how this floor works. Howard's voice was measured in carries. I've seen how the staff moves when you come onto this floor. I've seen what fear looks like in a workplace because I spent 40 years managing people. And I know the difference between a team that respects their leadership and a team that's afraid of it. He paused. I also know what it looks like when a man is about to do something he can't take back. So I'm going to ask you to step away from my nurse and go back to wherever it is you came from. The hallway was absolutely still. Megan was at the far end, frozen. Terrence had appeared from somewhere, standing very still, watching. 2 other staff members were present, both seeing everything. James looked at Howard Gable, then back at Clara. The calculation was visible in his face. The rapid, desperate recalibration of a man who has just had the audience he was counting on evaporate and be replaced by an audience of exactly the wrong kind. Witnesses, people with names and positions, and the capacity to remember. He said nothing. He adjusted his jacket. He turned and walked away. Clara watched him go. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had fully faded. Then she turned to Howard and said, "Thank you." "I told you I'm not kind," Howard said. "I'm practical." She almost smiled. "Yes, you did tell me that." At 5:30, Clara sat in her car in the parking garage and made 3 calls in sequence. First to Helen Carver, reporting the afternoon's events in detail. Helen said, "Board session is confirmed for 7 tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Second to Dr. Lena Park, updating the case file with the day's additions. Michelle Daniels' envelope, Gerald Hume's contact, Howard Gable as a voluntary witness. Lena said, "Clara, this is substantial. This is more than I expected." Third to Megan, not to report anything, just to say, "You've been brave today. All of you have." Megan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it going to work?" Clara looked through the windshield at the concrete of the parking garage, at the ordinary gray architecture of a building that had no idea it was standing at the edge of something. "Yes," she said, "it's going to work." "How can you be sure?" "Because he came to me today without Paul, without a script, without the performance." She paused. "He was afraid. That's how I know." She drove home, made tea, did not open the notebook. There was nothing left to write tonight. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. The documentation was complete. The witnesses were prepared. The board session was confirmed. The network was assembled and holding. Tomorrow was Friday, and on Friday, James Comas was going to walk onto her floor for the last time. She did not know yet exactly how it was going to end. She knew only that it was going to end, and that when it did, she would be ready. She had always been ready. That was the part nobody at Ridgeview knew yet. That was the part that James Comas, for all his calculating intelligence, had completely failed to account for. He had looked at a woman with a canvas tote bag and a kind face and a month on the job, and he had seen what he always saw when he looked at the people around him. Someone who could be broken. He had no way of knowing that Clara Jensen had spent 8 years in places where breaking was not an option. No way of knowing what she had done before she became a nurse, what she had been trained to do, what she had already survived. No way of knowing that the calm he had been trying to crack for 4 weeks was not a performance. It was just who she was. And tomorrow, he was going to find that out. The board session started at 7 in the morning and ran for 2 hours and 19 minutes. Clara was not in the room. She was not supposed to be. Helen Carver had been clear about that. The preliminary board session was internal, legal counsel only, no external parties until the formal process was initiated. Clara's role in that room was the documentation she had provided, the names she had gathered, the time-stamped record of 4 weeks of systematic observation. Her physical presence was not required. Her work already spoke for her. So she went to work. She arrived at Ridgeview at 6:52, 8 minutes before her shift started, the same as every morning. She nodded at Dennis, the security guard, who nodded back this time, which told her nothing about what he knew, and everything about the fact that the building had a different energy today. Something had shifted overnight. She could feel it in the lobby the same way she had felt the held breath silence on Thursday morning, except this was not held breath. This was something closer to the particular stillness that comes just before a long overdue thing finally happens. Megan was at the station already. She looked at Clara the moment she walked onto the floor and said, without preamble, "Terrence heard from someone in admin that there's a board session happening right now. Emergency, 7 in the morning, legal counsel present." She paused. "Did you know about this?" "Yes," Clara said. Megan stared at her for 3 full seconds. "How long have you known?" "Since Wednesday night." Another pause. "And you didn't tell me." "I needed you to come to work this morning and be exactly yourself. If you'd known, you would have been watching the clock since 5 a.m. Clara looked at her steadily. "You needed to sleep." Megan opened her mouth, closed it. Then, with the expression of someone who has decided that being annoyed is less important than being right, "Fair, that's fair." She lowered her voice. "What happens after the session?" "I don't know exactly. Helen said she would contact me." Clara picked up the first chart of the morning. "Until then, we work." The floor ran. 7:15, 7:40, 8 o'clock. Patients came awake with their morning needs and their morning fears, and the staff moved through the rooms with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the doing is almost meditative. Clara was present in every room she entered, in the way that had become her signature on the floor, completely there, no part of her attention elsewhere, so that every patient she touched that morning felt, however briefly, like the only person in the building who mattered. Howard Gable was being discharged that morning. He was dressed and ready when Clara came to do his final checks, sitting in the chair beside the bed with his bag packed and his daughter-in-law's business card visible on the nightstand, a duplicate he had clearly set out deliberately. He looked at Clara with the sharp-eyed assessment he had brought to every interaction since day one. "Big day," he said. "Every day is a big day in a hospital," she replied. "You know what I mean." She checked his vitals, noted everything in order. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, which was not standard checkout protocol, and said, "Mr. Gable, what you did yesterday, stepping into that hallway, I need you to know that it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 40 years building things, bridges mostly. You know what the most important part of a bridge is?" He did not wait for an answer. The moment when the two sides finally meet in the middle. Everything before that is just preparation. Everything after that is just the bridge doing what it was built to do. He picked up the business card and held it toward her again, and this time she took it with both hands. "Call her if you need her. She doesn't charge for the first conversation." She walked him to the elevator, watched the doors close, turned back to the floor. At 8:47, her phone buzzed with a text from Helen Carver. 4 words: "Session complete. Stay available." Clara read it twice and felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief yet, not victory, something more like the sensation of a very long-held breath beginning, slowly, to release. At 9:15, the second text came, longer this time. "Board has voted to place CEO in immediate administrative leave pending full investigation. HR and legal are being briefed now. He will be notified this morning. I need you to know, the documentation you provided was the foundation of everything. Be ready. The next few hours will be complicated." Clara read it standing at the nurse's station. She did not react visibly. She put the phone in her pocket. Megan was 4 feet away and watched her face with the focused attention of someone who has learned to read subtle signals. "What?" Megan said quietly. Clara looked at her. "He's on administrative leave as of this morning." The words took a moment to land. Megan's face moved through about 4 expressions in rapid succession. Shock, then a brief involuntary smile, then something that was dangerously close to tears, then the controlled, deliberate steadiness of someone who is deciding how to feel about something they have wanted for a long time and were not sure would ever actually happen. "It's real," Megan said. "It's real." Just like that. 4 weeks of work and 9 people's courage, Clara said. "Not just like that." Megan pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened and nodded and said, Okay, what do we do now?" "We work," Clara said. "Same as always." What neither of them knew yet, what no one on the floor knew yet, was that James Combs had been notified at 9:05 that morning, that the notification had been delivered by the board chair himself in James's office with legal counsel present, that James had listened to the first 60 seconds of it and then stood up from his desk and said, very quietly, "This is her. This is that nurse." And the board chair had said, "James, this is 9 people and 5 years of documented conduct. Sit down." And James had not sat down. He had walked out of the office. He had walked to his car. Then he had sat in his car for 11 minutes. And then, and this was the part that nobody could have fully predicted, the part that revealed more about James Comey than 5 years of watching his face had done, he had gotten out of his car and walked back into the building. Not to his office, to the elevator, to the nursing floor. He arrived at 9:31. Clara knew the moment he stepped off the elevator because she had learned his footsteps well enough by now that she could identify them the way you identify a familiar voice. Not by thinking about it, by knowing it immediately and without effort. She was in the hallway outside room 4 when she heard them. Fast, hard, but different today. The rhythm was wrong. Too fast. Not the deliberate, territorial pace of a man in control of where he is going. The pace of a man who has lost the script and is operating entirely on adrenaline and fury. She turned to face the hallway. He came around the corner, and when he saw her, he stopped walking. He was in his suit from the morning, the board meeting suit, dark gray, perfectly pressed 12 hours ago. and now carrying the particular dishevelment of a man who has been through something violent without anything actually touching him. His collar was loosened. His hair, always immaculate, was not quite right. He looked at her the way people look at the specific point of origin of something that has destroyed them. "You," he said. The hallway was not empty. Megan was 20 feet away. Terrence had appeared at the far end. 2 other nurses were visible. Doctor Marsh was coming out of a patient room and had stopped, hands still on the door handle, reading the situation in the particular rapid way of someone with 9 years of experience reading James Comas. "Mr. Comas," Clara said. Her voice was even. "You've been placed on administrative leave. You should not be on this floor. You destroyed this." His voice was not the controlled register he had used in every previous encounter. It was raw. It was the voice of someone who has had every performance stripped away, and what is underneath is not dignified. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea?" "I documented the truth," Clara said. "That's all I did." "You came here with an agenda. You came here specifically to—" "I came here to be a nurse." She held his gaze, steady, unbroken. "Everything after that was a response to what you did, to Keisha, to Sandra, to Robert, to every person on this floor who has been living in fear of you for 5 years." Something moved across his face. The mention of names, specific names, said out loud, in a hallway, in front of witnesses. There is a particular moment when a man who has operated in institutional shadows for years hears the specific evidence of his actions, spoken plainly and publicly for the first time, and something in him understands that it is over. Not just the job, the version of reality he has been sustaining, the story he told himself. James took a step toward her. Every person in that hallway registered it simultaneously. Dr. Marsh moved. "James!" James's hand came up. What happened in the next 4 seconds was fast enough that several people who were present would later struggle to reconstruct the exact sequence, though all of them were certain of the beginning and the end. His hand came up with a clear intention of striking her. Clara's response was not hesitation, and it was not panic. It was the clean, unhesitating precision of a body that has been trained for exactly this. The specific, controlled movement of someone who has spent years learning how to neutralize a threat with minimum force and maximum efficiency. Her left hand intercepted his wrist before it reached her face. Her right hand found the pressure point at the inside of his elbow. Her body weight shifted in a way that required no visible effort, but produced an immediate and undeniable physical result. James Comas, CEO, 6 feet tall, 190 pounds, was on the floor in 3 seconds. Not thrown, not knocked, guided down with a controlled, precise application of force that left him on his knees with his arms secured behind him at an angle that produced considerable discomfort without causing injury. She held him there with one hand. Her breathing had not changed. The hallway was absolutely silent. James was making a sound. Not a word. Something involuntary. The sound of a man whose body has been taken out of his own control for the first time in his life and who does not know what to do with the information. "Let go," he said. His voice had no authority left in it. None. It was just a man on a hospital floor asking to be released. "Security is on the way," Clara said calmly. "I'm going to hold this position until they arrive. If you stop resisting, this will be more comfortable for both of us." He stopped resisting. The hallway remained silent for another 12 seconds. It felt much longer. And in that silence, something happened that could not have been engineered or planned or anticipated. It simply happened, the way true things happen, without permission or announcement. Every person standing in that hallway looked at James Comas on the floor and felt something change in them. Not satisfaction, not cruelty, something more fundamental. The specific cellular level shift that occurs in people who have been afraid of something for a very long time and have just watched that thing become small. The man who had filled this building with fear for 5 years, who had ended careers and left marks on people's arms and made grown professionals practice what they would say before speaking to him, was on a hospital floor, held there by a woman with one hand, asking to be let go. Megan had both hands pressed to her face. Her eyes were full. Terrence was standing completely still, and his expression was the specific expression of a man who is not going to cry because he decided 30 years ago that he was not that kind of man, but who is having to work harder at that decision than usual. 2 security officers arrived at 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Clara released James to them with a clean handoff and a verbal summary of the incident that was precise, unemotional, and complete. She gave them the names of every witness present. She stated clearly that she would provide a written account within the hour. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She was, in every observable way, a professional completing a professional task. James Comas was escorted from the floor. He did not speak again. He walked with the security officers with his head slightly down and his jacket no longer fully aligned on his shoulders. And when the elevator doors closed behind him, the hallway held its silence for one more moment. Then Dr. Marsh said, quietly but clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "It's over." Nobody responded, but everyone in that hallway heard it the same way, not as information, but as permission. Permission to believe that the thing they had been told was simply the way things were at this hospital had in fact ended. Clara turned back to the floor. "Let's check on our patients," she said, and they did. The next 90 minutes were the most surreal of the workday, the clinical business of the floor continuing with complete fidelity to its normal rhythms, while simultaneously every person on it was processing something enormous. Medications were given, charts were updated, families were consulted, procedures were completed, and underneath all of it, moving person to person, in the quiet lateral communication of a floor staff that has been together long enough to speak without speaking, the understanding that something had ended that they had not believed would ever end. At 11:15, Helen Carver arrived on the floor in person. She had not announced she was coming. She walked to the nurses' station and found Clara there and said, "The board is convening a formal session this afternoon. James's termination will be processed through proper procedure, which will take a few days, but the outcome is not in question." She paused. "I also need to tell you something that will become public shortly." "Go ahead," Clara said. "Board counsel contacted the state licensing authority this morning. Between what you provided and what Dr. Marsh provided, and with Gerald Hume agreeing to have his settlement reviewed, we have enough for a regulatory investigation into conduct that goes beyond employment law." Helen held her gaze. "This is not just about Ridgeview anymore. The investigation will potentially look at his previous institution as well. There are indications that this is not the first time." Clara was very still for a moment. "How long has the board suspected that?" Helen's expression shifted into something that was not quite guilt and not quite resignation, but somewhere in the space between them. "Some of us have had concerns, but concerns without documentation are just concerns." She paused. "You gave us documentation." 9 people gave you documentation," Clara said. "I just made sure it got to you." Helen looked at her for a long moment. "The board is going to want to discuss the floor's transition going forward. Interim leadership, staffing review, protocol reconstruction. I'd like you to be part of those conversations." Clara said, "I'm a floor nurse." "You're considerably more than that, and I think you know it." Helen tilted her head slightly. "Although I notice you're still not going to tell me exactly what you were before you were a floor nurse." "I was someone who learned that institutional fear isn't inevitable," Clara said. "That's the part that matters." Helen almost smiled. "We'll need to talk more, formally." She extended her hand. Clara shook it. "What you did here, the patience of it, the precision. I've been in institutions for 30 years. I've never seen anyone dismantle something like this so carefully, so completely. I had good people around me, Clara said. Helen left, and Clara turned back to the station and found Megan standing there with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who has been holding too many feelings for too long and is beginning to run out of internal storage space for them. She wants you involved in the transition, Megan said. I heard. Clara, Megan looked at her with the directness of someone who has earned the right to ask the next question. Are you going to stay at Ridgeview after all of this? Clara was quiet for a moment. Are you? Megan blinked. Yes. I mean, now, yes. If this place actually changes, if the people who've been afraid get to come back in. She stopped. Sandra, do you think they'd let Sandra come back? I think that conversation is worth having. Megan's eyes went bright again. She pressed her lips together and nodded, the nod of someone making a private decision in a public moment. Then yes, I'm staying. Clara looked at the floor around her, at Terrence, who had quietly returned to his work, with the particular focused energy of a man who is processing something large by giving it no external surface. At Bev, who was sitting with a patient at the end of the hall, the quiet one, the one who only spoke when she had something worth saying, and who had, in the end, said exactly the right things at exactly the right moments. At Dr. Marsh, who was standing at the doorway of a patient room with a chart in his hand and a look on his face that was the specific look of someone who is deciding, consciously and deliberately, to believe that things can be different. The afternoon moved forward the way afternoons move in hospitals, without waiting for the emotional state of the people in them to catch up, because the work does not pause for reckoning. 3 o'clock, 3:30, 4. Clara moved through the remainder of her shift with the same focused presence she brought to every shift. And if anything was different about her today, it was only that the weight she had been carrying for 4 weeks, the weight of the plan, of the documentation, of the careful strategic architecture of what she had been building, was gone. Not replaced by lightness, exactly, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like what it actually was. The end of a necessary thing, completed. At 4:45, her phone rang. The number was Keisha Daniels. Clara answered it in the break room with the door closed. Keisha's voice was not what Clara expected. She had expected tears, or relief, or the particular rawness of someone who has been carrying something painful for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. What she heard instead was something simpler. Keisha said, "My sister called me." "I know. She said he's gone." "He's gone," Clara confirmed. A pause, long enough that Clara waited, simply present on the line, not filling the silence. And then Keisha said something that Clara would remember long after she had forgotten most of the details of the 4 weeks that changed Ridgeview Medical Center. She said, "I took those photographs because part of me believed, even that night, that someday someone was going to ask for them. I don't know why I believed that. I just did." Her voice was steady, careful, the voice of someone choosing each word. "I need you to know that the part of me that believed that, you're the reason that part was right." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You kept the evidence," she said. "That was you." "And you showed up," Keisha said. "That was you." They stayed on the line together for another minute without speaking. Sometimes that is the only appropriate response to something true. Clara drove home at 6 o'clock in the 10-year-old Civic with a cracked windshield. She made eggs and toast. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to the last page she had written on. The page with 2 words at the top. The page that said, 48 hours, written the night before Thursday. She looked at those words for a moment, then she closed the notebook. She did not need it anymore. In the weeks that followed, Ridgeview Medical Center began the long, uneven, necessary process of becoming something different. It was not fast, and it was not clean. Institutional change never is. There were difficult conversations and contested decisions, and at least 2 more departures from the executive team as the board's investigation pulled at threads that James had tucked away in places he had been confident no one would look. Gerald Hume's settlement was reviewed, found to contain clauses that counsel determined unenforceable in the context of documented illegal conduct, and Gerald gave his testimony to the regulatory board with the particular fortified calm of a man who had been waiting to tell the truth for 18 months. Sandra Leong was called by Helen Carver personally and offered her position back, with back pay for the period following her wrongful termination, pending board approval that came through in 11 days. She accepted. Keisha Daniels did not return to Ridgeview. She was not ready for that, and nobody pushed her. But she filed her formal statement, and her photographs were entered into the regulatory record, and she told Clara in a text message one evening that filing it had felt like setting down a stone she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing the weight. Clara Jensen stayed at Ridgeview. She was asked to serve on the hospital's newly formed Patient Advocacy and Workplace Safety Committee, a body that had not existed under James's tenure and that Helen Carver personally championed through the board. Clara accepted the role with one condition, that Megan Cho and Dr. Alan Marsh serve alongside her. Both said yes before she had finished asking. She continued doing her morning rounds. She continued sitting with patients who needed someone to sit with them. She continued answering questions with the honest directness that had made an 80-year-old retired schoolteacher named Mr. Ellsworth accept a blood draw without protest in her very first week. She continued carrying the canvas tote and driving the Civic with the cracked windshield and sleeping well at night because she had always slept well when the plan was solid. And on the floor of Ridgeview Medical Center, something happened gradually and then all at once. The way things change when fear has been the operating system for long enough that people have forgotten what it felt like before. People started staying longer, asking questions, laughing in the break room at a normal volume, filing incident reports when incident reports needed to be filed, speaking in meetings, disagreeing with each other constructively and professionally, and without terror of what it would cost them by Monday. The footsteps that had once made the whole floor hold its breath faded into the past, not forgotten because the people who had heard them for 5 years did not forget them, would not forget them for a long time, but no longer the defining sound of the building, replaced, gradually, by something more ordinary and more valuable. The sound of a place where people came to be healed, and the people doing the healing were no longer afraid. This was not a miracle. It was not a sudden transformation. It was the slow, daily, unglamorous work of an institution deciding to be better than the worst thing it had allowed. And it was possible only because one woman had walked through the front doors on a Monday morning in October with a canvas tote bag and a notebook and the steady, unshakable certainty that fear is never as permanent as it appears. Clara Jensen was not a hero. She was simply someone who had decided, a long time ago, that when she saw a wall built out of fear, she would find the foundation, and she would take it apart, one documented fact at a time. And this time, like every time before, she had.